Yeah, I mean, we can break every rule in the book. There are no rules in podcasting, but everybody seems to get into that mindset that there are rules. Podcast by Friday with Bill Griggs and Kingsley Grant. We help people to create their minimal viable podcast by taking bold action to defeat procrastination and to get their voices heard. During my last brainstorming session with my co-host Kingsley Grant, we talked about the challenge of putting together a podcast episode using the narrative format instead of the normal interview or question and answer format. By the way, I'm Bill Griggs, and this is Podcast by Friday, and here's what we had to say. It is a totally different, more time-intensive process to do this style of episode. I just listened to a podcast, and it was completely about this subject, and it was a guy who had just started a new podcast doing interview style.
The podcasts I've listened to are just interview style, and these are the 5 questions you need to ask, and this is the format, this is how the flow, that it doesn't have to be that way, so I give them permission and just feel free to experiment.
Yeah, I mean, we can break every rule in the book. There are no rules in podcasting, but everybody seems to get into that mindset that there are rules. If you're going to do the narrative style podcast, like NPR, you've got to do these little 5-second vignettes or 10, and keep breaking it up with music and all of that. And, really that's just what NPR settled on as their style. Nobody else has to do that. It's just one way that they do it. It's just like their broadcast on the radio. If you do an interview style, you got a completely different set of, quote, rules that we can break or use on that. And there's nothing that says you can't mix them up. The young man knows the rules, but the old man knows the exceptions. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr. I think it'd be really cool if we did a couple of episodes in the one style and then do a totally different style in the thing, and then explain after we've started in that style of interview, let the reader say, hey, something's different. And then, maybe pop it up in the middle of the episode. You may have noticed that we sound different this week.
And here's why. Here's what's going on.
Yeah. Because, and then we talk about rules. Maybe that's the episode, rules. And how to break them. The fastest way to succeed is to look as if you're playing by somebody else's rules while quietly playing by your own. Michael Korda.
Again, the whole point is that we're afraid to do a paradigm shift when you have to, or to pivot, all that kind of stuff. That's how life is. That's how business works anyway. You don't have to color between the lines as you've been taught, because we have that gotten most people who color between the lines. It's okay to color outside the lines, because we've seen how those who do are the ones who actually are able to make the most impact really in the world, because they're chosen to go back to the break the rules idea.
Here's 2 prime examples. John Lee Dumas broke the rule. He said, I think I can do a daily podcast. And everyone's like, what? You're crazy, man. How will you produce it? That's going to be impossible. You can't. Nobody's done that. Why? And so now he's probably got the most downloads of pretty much everybody. He's crushing it. And another episode with Sarah Koenig, when she decided to do serial podcasts. Nobody had a long running narrative podcast before that, and they crushed it. And on and on and on. It's because they broke the rules. Everybody said, no, you can't do that, and they did it. And that made them interesting and stand out in the crowd.
And that's where I think sometimes what gets my attention when I listen to podcasts is look for those who are a unique style, what are they coming with? Because you get to hear the same old, and you tend to hear one, you hear them all, and therefore you're looking for that fresh voice, that fresh idea. And I think it's those who break the rules catch your attention because it's different.
I don't live by a lot of society's rules. I can't pattern myself after the herd. Kim Bassam. So how can we stand out from the herd? How can we break the rules so that things work out in our favor? One method is to take a tried and true idea and mix it in with another tried and true idea to come up with a new formula. I was thinking on this, if we're doing each of the, the novel styles of podcasts for an episode, this might be intense, and we can not do this if you want, but we could do 7 daily podcasts as part of this, somewhere down the pike. And in those 7 days, we actually launch a podcast. We're doing the steps that we did when we were doing the podcast by Friday thing. So this is the special episode. They're 10 minutes long. These are the tasks. This is what you got to accomplish day 1. And we could build momentum around it or build interest around it by promoting it before it happens, getting folks on the mailing list or whatever to come along and do it with us. If you stick with us through these 7 days, you'll have a podcast at the end. Now, we're giving it away free, but at the end of it, maybe we sell the guides or something or whatever to make money. Yeah. The downside of that is we're actually launching a new podcast in addition to this. Yeah.
But I mean, it could be just, you could launch a podcast and just, not to really run a podcast show, just to launch and say, hey, it will happen, and just let it fade. Not fade, but, put it on a shelf. Or we could...
You don't learn to walk by following the rules. You learn by doing and by falling over. Sir Richard Branson. Almost everybody knows what they want a podcast about. They just don't know what part of what it is that they want a podcast about that they want to podcast about. Let me rephrase that. So everybody knows the subject that they want a podcast about, like cheese, but they might not.
Or knitting.
Yeah, or knitting, but they might not know that they want to talk about the cheese of the Eastern European continent people eat while they're knitting. That might be their podcast. I don't think we have to spend a lot of time on mindset and, exploring what your niche is.
Right, no.
Because most people already come to the idea that they want a podcast with an idea.
Right.
Or at least that's been my experience. I mean, I knew I wanted this podcast about CNC routers. As strange as that may seem, that's what I wanted to do. You wanted to do one about people in midlife choosing new career or new path and direction. So you already had that.
I often conduct interviews in my truck. William Shatner.
Because that is one of the big things when you're first starting your podcast is how do you get interviews? Who do you go to if you're doing interview style? Like I interviewed several CNC guys when I first started out, and that was very good, and it built some nice episodes, and they get listened to quite a bit. But then what do you do for round 2? Do you do more of the same? Do you go outside the CNC thing? If I had a list of people sitting there that said they want, they're open for interviews, that would have taken a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of hesitation out of the process because I know they already want to be interviewed. Versus,
where did you find those CNC people you interviewed? Is that you knew them ahead of time, or you found them through? How did you find them?
Some of them I knew ahead of time. Some of them were recommended to me. Most of them, or I think all of them, except for one, was in my CNC group already. Which I had a Facebook group, so
give it an advantage.
Yeah, if you if you're going fishing, you go where the fish are. And I already had a nice little pond of people on Facebook that were, into my topic. So it doesn't even take long to build a Facebook group. Maybe that's that's not really something for this, but it should be something that you consider doing later on after you've got your podcast launched and you're trying to build your audience. Give them someplace to gather, either a Facebook group or a private community or a forum or whatever you're comfortable building. You should have some way to keep your people, your tribe together.
I think by us introducing these ideas, it's putting other options out there. Because, how many people know about these other things they could do as a podcaster? They can take their content and repurpose that. And it could be posted in other avenues. They could take their content and make a blog post of that and use that blog post eventually to write a book or an ebook. So they could have a product up in very short time if they're very intentional in what they're doing with their show. So I guess by us kind of modeling and highlighting those ideas, now they're thinking, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. Oh, I didn't think about that. I could see that. I think that would be a great way. I could see how expanding wider and making it very attractive because now they are exposed to those things.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was John Lee Dumas or Tim Ferriss who talked about every time that they did content, they generated 4 things from the same content. They got something for the podcast episode, they got something for their blog, they got something in a quick email and something else. I don't remember what the 4th thing was. I think it was actually Tim Ferriss, but it's been a while since I read the 4-Hour Workweek. But it was in there. I have to go back and try and find that. But yeah, it builds your content. Oh, I remember. The other thing was video. Yeah, and if you're thinking, along those lines right from the beginning, it's pretty simple. Hey, what about show notes? Everybody's always griping and complaining about show notes. Do you use show notes in your episodes?
I really put, it's not a whole lot. I mean, I just put like a condensed version of the show itself because I don't necessarily want to retell everything. They can go listen to it. That's the whole point of the podcast. And I know some people give transcripts, some people write extended show notes, but I find, the shows I listen to, I very rarely, unless there's something that catch my attention and they go and find, I don't want to forget, I go to the show notes. But other than that, I don't go to the show notes. Do you?
No, I had listened to podcasts for years before I actually went looking for show notes for an episode. In fact, everyone always, says, oh, you're going to put it in the show notes and everything. And nobody ever really explains what show notes are. And, it seems when you talk to podcasters that show notes are one of the biggest pains that they have.
Yep.
In the creation process. So, I don't know. What do you tend to have in your show notes? How do you create your show notes for your show?
What I do is, for me, I just kind of do a little blurb about the topic, for example, on pornography or for example, it's a thing that most men struggle with. And what happened as you tend to transition into midlife, it slows you down, and here's how it slows you down. The time investment, and then that turns to money investment for your time per hour, per dollar. And so I talk about this in the show. So if you want to hear more about that, you can listen to the show. Then I have links that I mentioned in the links that I mentioned. And at the bottom, of course, I encourage them to go and sign up to go to iTunes and give me a rating and review. And other links I have from my books and stuff inside there. That's really all my show notes, really. I can write my show notes in 15 minutes the most. 10, 15 minutes I can write my show notes because I have some parts that are always repeated. So how do you do yours?
Well, the way I do the show notes in the CNC Router Tips show is that I will just basically give them a paragraph at the beginning telling them, because it's a question and answer show for the most part, what the question was. I don't go into what the answer was because they should listen to the episode if they want to find out. But I will give them all the links to, anything that was mentioned in the show.
Right. Okay.
In one section. And then the bottom of the show notes is actually something that I started doing just as a test in the hopes that I would increase my ratings and reviews in iTunes. I have a section that tells them how to leave a rating and review in iTunes and walks them through it. That's all part of every show note.
Now, I guess, I don't do well, and I think I need to find a way to do this, like tracking to see how many people actually open that page. I need to do a better job of that because I have no clue.
Yeah, I don't track it myself, and that's something I should do because whenever you track something or measure it, it improves.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I need to do my Google analytics to see how that goes. I haven't. I need to one day, maybe when I speak to you again. 'Cause I really don't. Here's one of my problems is that I don't track it as much. I really don't fully understand Google analytics. That's my problem.
Mm-hmm. I don't think Google understands Google Analytics.
Well, I feel better then. Thank you.
Yeah. But
okay, that made me feel better. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's one of those things because it's such a large organization and so many teams of software programmers are working on various aspects of it. Because Google doesn't want you to game their system, to go in and hack the way that your analytics respond. They purposely, I think, make it difficult to get a real good read on exactly what goes into Google Analytics and getting the right SEO. That's just my opinion after a couple of years of doing blogging.
Yeah.
So I'm on Pat Flynn's website, and Smart Passive Income, and I'm looking around, trying to find any reference on his page to show notes. So I scroll down, and there's nothing on the first page. Okay, so I go to his podcast. He has his podcast listed, and I click on Smart Passive Income. And that takes me to the podcast section of it. Okay, let's see. So, latest episode is shown. An overview, all episodes. Let's see. Scrolling. Still, nothing about show notes. So, let me...
Is that his... Is that his... Ask Pat
podcast?
No,
this is Smart Passive Income.
Okay.
Okay, so he's got episodes here. I'm going to click on episode 224, and that takes me to his page for episode 224. And now he has basically a blog post that tells what's in there and thanks us for listening. Encourages you to download his app, and then he has a section that says download the transcript, download the MP3 audio file, download the mobile app. Let's see, or download ebooks the smart way. So that's his lead magnet. So
And no show notes yet.
Nothing that says show notes or anything, unless this is his show notes. This page by itself, as a single blog post. So let's go to Cliff Ravenscraft's website. Cliff has a really cool podcast, Podcast Answer Man.
Yeah.
.com for our listeners. So we're on Cliff's page, podcast equipment, products, resources, training courses, episodes, podcast episodes. So let us go to podcast episodes because that's probably fair. And let's look at episode 460, his latest one. And he's got a player, he's got a graphic, and then he's got notes or basically a blog post that talks about what's in this episode. Let's see.
So that's his show notes.
Yeah. Then a podcasting A to Z blurb for his course that he's having, and free monthly media hosting with Libsyn, another offer, podcast video tutorials to teach you how to do it, social media links, and then comments on the bottom. So again, nothing that says show notes, but I suspect that this is what they mean. It's a blog post about their episode, and they're probably 500 words, maybe max, for each of these. I looked through many podcasts before I found one that actually gave me a real hint at what show notes were really all about. And the one that I found that had the clearest use of show notes was 4hourworkweek.com, which is Tim Ferriss's podcast. Tim Ferriss is an award-winning podcaster who has a best-selling book called The 4-Hour Workweek, which if you haven't read it, I highly suggest you do so. There will be a link in our show notes. When we went up to 4hourworkweek.com and clicked on the podcast button, we came to a page that listed some information about the Tim Ferriss Show, and when we scrolled down further, we saw a heading that said show notes, links, and resources for all episodes. And there, Tim had a link for each of his episodes. And so you choose the episode that you want, navigate to it, and you get the show notes for that episode, along with other information like an introduction of the guest that appeared on there, along with pictures, and also you could see the audio files for each of the podcasts if you wanted to play them there. Then further on down on his page, he had another title that said show notes. And in Tim's show, he lists each topic that was covered inside of the episode with a timestamp. So he's carrying it very far, because if you want to hear about, for instance, in his interview with Seth Godin, how do you build a tribe from scratch, then you just go to 7 minutes and 26 seconds into the recording. But if you wanted to look at how does Seth deal with fear, and does it ever stop, then you could just go to 20 minutes and 48 seconds to find that information out. So very detailed, very time-consuming method of doing show notes, but very thorough. So based on my searches of several popular podcasts, I've come to the conclusion about the rule about show notes. That rule is, there really is none. Rules are meant to be broken. Laws are meant to be obeyed. Bill Griggs. Podcast by Friday. Take bold action to create your minimal viable podcast today. Check out new episodes at podcastbyfriday.com or on iTunes or Spreaker.